Hey, what's up? Silas here. I'm just giving a little intro to this video. This is the second part of a discussion I'm having with my friend Steven about the 1619 project, which is a project put on by the New York Times in the United States of America. And the general premise of the people who wrote this project, from what I've seen, is that the United States of America, the country that is the United States of America right now, began back in 1619 when the first slave was brought across from Africa on the transatlantic slave trade to the continent of North America. And since that was the beginning of the country, that foundationally the United States of America still is a racist country, and then some things follow from that. So in that first part, we were discussing different parts, went through the website, what was presented in the New York Times, and we just gave some observations and thoughts of what we've seen around this 1619 project, because some of the issues coming up are that it's being proposed to be taught as history in actual curriculum in schools and things like that. And then just general public who take it in are taking this content like it is actual history, direct history of what actually happened. And Stephen and I, for various reasons, had already researched and looked into things that we definitely did not agree with that proposal. I think we both agree that in general, people today are more moral and ethical than they were in the past. We're not saying the founding fathers were somehow these immaculate beings. We're not stating that at all. We're not saying the United States of America today can't be improved. On the contrary, it's because we understand they were flawed, because we understand their improvements today, is the reason why we want to take advantage of the access to information that we have to get a more accurate understanding of what was and what is, so we can do a better job of playing a part in what can be in the future. And I think that is part of the 1619 project. They're saying what we've been taught about history is wrong. This is accurate. So is it accurate? And that is just what we're going to continue to discuss in part 2 of this series. So getting into that. Hey, what's up? Silas here, and I'm here with Stephen again.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah. We're here for the second part of the continuation of this discussion that I've had with him over the 1619 project, which is this project by a couple of writers that was put together by the New York Times newspaper in the United States of America. And the general premise of that, the project in general, seems to be that they're saying in 1619, when the first slave was brought on the transatlantic slave trade and landed, it was someplace in Connecticut, or where was it? Do you recall?
I should know this. I'd have to check off the top of my head.
But it's somewhere in what is now the Northeast of America. The first slave landed there in the slave trade, and they say that that was the initiation of the United States of America, and that has created this undercurrent or this underpinning. The foundation of the United States of America is supposedly on the slave trade and has been built up from there. And for some of you, that might already be something that you're questioning. And that's something that me and Stephen have questioned and wondered what were they trying to say about this. And we had a long conversation about that already, right?
Yes.
It was about a 2.5 hour long conversation. You can check that out because in that one we go through part by part of what's on the website and give our thoughts and ideas and just try to get some understanding, have a conversation, as the people who write these things are wont to say. Let's actually have a conversation about these topics. And we think it's important because we are both somewhat fans of the United States of America and some of the things that are in what that nation is, despite our possibly anarchist type leanings. We're thinking, okay, they've done a decent job. There's some good things, some bad things. But if it truly is based on slavery, that is a horrific thing. And what would that say about the people who support it and do the things? Can you take out that slavery aspect and still keep the good? So there are all these things in it. And what I have seen personally about the 1619 project is it has been used to do some things that I am not quite comfortable with. It seems to be making certain assertions without backing it with evidence and being destructive to things that I consider rather positive, without giving any solutions. I don't know necessarily what the point of some of these people is, and the fact that they're taking it and teaching it as history and saying we're going to use this in schools and indoctrinate children, that is something that to me is rather disturbing and would have negative effects about society. What's your general idea of the
Well,
first part?
I was going to add to the point, but you've seen it. You even posted it in discussions. But there was the the two tweets from Nicole Hannah Jones. The one, she says, "I've said explicitly before. This might not be the exact wording, but basically, I've said before that this isn't history." But then in the next one, she says, "I'm submitting this to classrooms for use in history curriculums." So curricula, I guess you would say. So she's admitting at the same time, okay, this isn't really history. It's more of a retelling. It's more of a story. But at the same time, I'm going to have it taught in history. And at that point, you're basically admitting to pushing propaganda. That's the issue I have. I mean, at least in the case of someone like Howard Zinn, I may disagree, but he's presenting it as, okay, this is history just told from a different perspective, which, as I said last time, is important, obviously, but it is based on facts, even if they're cherry picked or omitted. But then in her case, she says, no, this is just a retelling of a story from a different perspective. It's not history, but then says it should be taught as history. And to me, that's really bad.
Yeah, it's disingenuous. I mean, if you want to just have a book, like I don't mind fictional things. I don't mind 12 Years of Slave being shown in school. I don't mind The Roots being shown in school. I don't mind even this actual thing being presented as what it is somebody's take on history. Present it that way and have the competing thoughts. But to teach it as history is just as bad as if the United States of America literally was saying we never kept slaves. If they literally tried to whitewash that out of history and started to retell their history, that would be as negative. They're like, oh no, the founding fathers, they just kind of sort of had these, they didn't really own slaves. No, they owned slaves. That is not something that we're saying didn't happen. We're not saying these things didn't happen. We're just saying present it as what it is. Even the Pulitzer Prize that this one won, and that is part of the impetus or the reason we got to this whole conversation. He posted something and then somebody came in and posted, well, it's a Pulitzer Prize award winning thing. And we're like, okay, what does that mean? What Pulitzer Prize does it mean? Why is Pulitzer supposedly says something historical? But even it was a section of this 10 plus part project that won it for, I think it was editorial, if I'm forgetting exactly what it was, but it wasn't in the category of historical literature that Pulitzer might have. Pulitzer has different, it's like the Oscars. There's fiction, there's best kiss, there's best actor, there's best historical drama, there's best animation. Yeah. So I'm not saying it's not something worth reading, but present it as what it is. And with this part, we're going to get into more of an analysis, of a critique of the actual content. So I would suggest you at least go check out the New York Times website, because that's at least what we went through in the last one. If you don't want to go through our entire critique of that or discussion of it, at least check those out, because it's kind of short and it will give you a general idea into what exactly Stephen, who is going to lead this one, this conversation off of, is going to be critiquing in this actual conversation. So go ahead.
One point I was going to sort of add on to this as well, and this is that book criticizing Howard Zinn, the author, made this point, and I think it sort of relates to this. Do you know who David Irving is?
No.
So he's interesting because he was actually sort of a mainstream World War II historian, but he went into, he became what's known as a Holocaust denier. And when he used to write his stuff, and he caught on with the mainstream. Like, he was always known for having a pro-German slant. He's British himself, but he was always known for having a pro-German slant. But most of his facts were pretty good, and apparently he even unearthed new documents that were previously unknown, such as Wilhelm Keitel's diary, if you know who he was. But of course, what ended up happening later was that he went into, of course, what they call Holocaust denial, and he was actually proven to have falsified a number of things. For example, in his books, he cuts and pastes parts of certain conversations and injects them into other conversations. He misattributes quotes, things like, And one of the things that made him famous was that he sued Deborah Lipstadt, who's an American Holocaust historian, because she attacked him, basically, and then after she attacked him, it really hurt his reputation. Publishers started running away from him, all that. So he took her to court. She won, of course, and she got a lot of support from Steven Spielberg and others. They actually funded her case. You should see the movie Denial if you ever have a chance. Rachel Weisz plays Lipstadt. It's a well-done movie. But
I don't
basically,
mind looking
the
at
point I'm
Rachel
trying to
Weisz.
make, and the point. What's that?
I said I also don't mind looking at Rachel Weisz.
Oh yeah,
I mean, she's a good actress. She's also
she is.
very easy on
But
that.
the larger point I'm trying to make, in that this is what Mary Graber wrote that book about Zinn said is we agree that Irving botched a lot of stuff, and it was deliberate because Irving speaks German perfectly, so he didn't mistranslate anything, that this was deliberate. He was pushing an agenda, so he distorted things.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, we rightfully call him out as a liar and somebody who's pushing an agenda and spreading misinformation and do it. So you wouldn't teach that stuff in school unless you were teaching, let's say, college students, okay, these are lies, Holocaust deniers push, here's what they say, if you see these, look out for them. And the point Mary Graber was making about Zinn, and what I would make about this, is that if you were teaching this in that same context, it would be fine. Okay, this is the misinformation, here's how it stacks up relative to the conventional narrative, and then if you see these points, this is misinformation. If you're teaching in that context, fine. But you wouldn't teach David Irving or this to kids and teach them, okay, this is the whole story. Because then at that point, you're just willfully spreading misinformation.
And I'm both a free speech absolutist and a truth absolutist. And I think most people are. And I cannot support somebody. Racism is bad. Slavery is bad. These are things that we know, and I think it's accepted by most people who would be. I'd be very surprised if somebody truly listens to this video and seriously thinks like slavery is still something that's up for debate. People might just debate just for the hell of debating, and maybe I could be able to put up some kind of defense for it. But personally, I did not support that, and I think this is a generally accepted thing, just from the sheer not the thing with the base principles where it's like just not the epistemology.
An axiom.
Yes, that's the basics of it, where it's just coming from the non-aggression principle, coming from the acceptance of private property. I have one of my earliest conversations on my channel was with good friend Nick. I don't know if you remember Nick. He was like really young guy in New York. He's an artist.
Maybe I saw him.
We had a conversation about private property. Like the basic premise was, can you sell yourself into slavery? And from the conversation we had, we tried to find ways, but it just couldn't be. You can't give somebody else ownership over your physical body. Like once that is a thing, like it would be at most indentured servitude.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
The whole premise of owning another human being isn't even something I consider to be a valid, possible thing.
No.
But slavery itself is it's a constant violation of somebody's existence. So it's not so yeah. I'm just so frustrated because the topic itself to me is 100% agreement with everybody who's writing that thing, that was a horrendous thing, that was a horrible thing that happened.
Of course.
But when people engage in these lies and massaging the truth and doing all these things in order to get a good message out, to me it fouls up that message. Because somebody might eventually start finding out, well, you're lying about this, and maybe it wasn't that. No, we need to actually report things as was. Like, it was bad enough as is. We don't need to embellish on it and add other things to it. It's already a horrendous thing. So why are you adding? What's the point of adding all these things?
I was going to say that was a similar thing with David Irving as well. That he wrote a book about, I think I'm trying to remember what it was called, but it was a book written about the super weapons program, and it's still considered a good book. And he wrote some stuff about bombing of Dresden. They say he did embellish the numbers there too, but as far as the details, it's pretty good. And like I said, he unearthed new documents. So if he had just stuck to those things, he would have actually gone down as being a good historian. He wouldn't have destroyed his reputation. But then when he started lying and got caught doing it, that tanked him completely.
Yeah, and that's an unfortunate thing. And I'm sure there's a lot of things in the 1619 project I'm sure there's a few things at least that were presented that were not really getting as much play in other spheres and being put on by the New York Times, which still has enough of a demographic that considers it to be a valid resource. And you look at these places, just like you're talking about with Irving, he brought out some new things. Like you go to the New York Times, majority of the New York Times is still just news. It's still literally, I'm reporting what has happened, and this is some new information that you haven't heard of has happened. It could be like simple cat stuck in a tree, celebrity has lost weight, those kind of things. Those things are just completely just, we are reporting what has occurred. And then they'll have the spin on something like, oh,
Yes.
Trump said this because of this way. Oh, the 1619 project, that means the entire United States of America is racist. Even the Democrat Party that we support is based on this racist. Like
Yeah.
it's like that. Those small things can end up discrediting all the positive things that you're trying to actually do, that you might actually have available to actual people. Just like one policeman going and kneeling on somebody's neck undoes the thousands of interactions police have had. Just how a few rioters going in and burning down a building as a loot takes away all the attention from the majority of protesters that are out there trying to get their message heard. And people don't realize this thing. And it's unfortunate. And I think we are doing a service, at least to myself, and I think some people out there, to have these critiques.
And that was the point with like the George Floyd thing. Like when it initially happened, everybody was saying this is a horrible thing. This guy shouldn't have died, all that. But then when people see footage of Target being looted, of minority-owned businesses being burned down, it's just, well, okay, what are we supporting now? And it's a shame because, again, the original cause, everyone was pretty much unified on it.
Yeah. Okay, so you said there was a particular critique that you found a lot of worth from, because I think that original post that sparked the idea to do this whole series of conversations was you were talking about a specific critique that you think did a very, very good job of breaking down and addressing certain problematic parts about the 1619 project, right? So who was the critique by?
So this was Phil Magness, who I talked about last time. Phil Magness is a scholar at the American Institute for Economic Research. That's in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I think you can tell by the name what they do. And he originally wrote this critique, if I recall, it was because those historians wrote to the New York Times criticizing the project, saying it has these falsehoods. And what he did was he was essentially responding to that critique, saying where the critics were right. And then I think there was one area where they were off base, which I can get into, but he wanted to delve into this deeper because he had investigated it on his own and found a lot of the same problems. So what he did was he wrote articles. Each article was addressing a separate topic, but then he decided to compile it into a book. Just that way, you will have it all at once. So.
Okay. So what was the name of the book?
So the book is called. Let's see. I have it right in front of me here. It's just the 1619 Project, a critique. Just
okay.
Very simple.
So yeah. And yeah, of course, if you want out there, you can go out and get this book and get access to it and read it as well to see what your thoughts are on it. Before you could pause this and then read it and then see if your thoughts will be the same as some that we might have. You might think of some new things, or you could just listen to this and then go back and read it yourself too and see if we were exaggerating things or if the take's different. And yeah, I think I encourage people getting the information as much as possible. And this is also why I'm very frustrated with things like this 1619 project, because we're living in a time where we have so much access to information to finding out the actual truths of some of these things. So when people take that and murk it up in the old way that history was in general embellished, it was in general very one-sided and biased, I am very encouraged about living in current timeline where we're actually living where, as I said in the previous conversation, it's no longer history. It's just story. It's just a human story being found. Like just watching these riots in Chicago, where in the past it was a lot easier for people to massage and say what the actual information was. We've already talked about how some people see, oh, it's just peaceful protests. What are you talking about? Some people only see the riots and things like that. But now you have a thing where it's like somebody's literally live streaming as they're walking through the riots and people are coming in. So you can see that information and get things directly. So when you have that, and then instead of just watching the live stream and taking it for yourself, somebody else gets it and embellishes it and twists it and points their spin on it, and then you just are okay with that. I'm not happy with that.
Well, and that's kind of to our point. Last time I mentioned about in Portland how there was that debate about is it peaceful protests or riots, but you have footage of both, so you can look at both and sort of weigh that bigger picture rather than okay, here's someone who plays this one clip and it's edited out of context, so you're not sure, or you just go by that blindly. But with this, it's okay, people on both sides of that argument can each make their case, and then you, the viewer, can make your own judgment accordingly, rather than just, okay, these people are telling you what to think.
Yeah. And with something like the 1619 project, I like the fact that you can put stuff out and take in the people commenting and giving their thoughts on it and critiquing it to make the thing stronger. If it can last through the critique, I think you'll find the thing is a lot more valuable than if it didn't. And these are these are topics, and also just the general premise that somebody releases something like this and has that premise. This is one thing we're still trying to. I think we just had a conversation today, trying to parse out exactly what it is. For them to think this is so brave and stunning to come out and talk about this, like it's like the white fragility book. Like white people are not comfortable with talking about these. Like when? What white people do you know that are not comfortable with talking about these issues? But yeah, so let's get into the talk.
I like what Eric July said, that whole thing where on his show he was making fun of, I forget which celebrity it was, but they said something like, I'm going to come out and say this, I am against police brutality. And it's like, dude, that's the popular opinion. There's nothing brave about taking that. You get in trouble if you said the exact opposite. Okay, so I'll just start this at the top here. It's on my tablet, so I don't know how well it doesn't really look too good here on the screen. You see it. So the first point here, this is interesting. How they rehabilitate the King Cotton thesis. I'm assuming you're familiar with that. That's basically that because cotton was such an integral part of the economy, all of the wealth created through the cotton production and trade via slave labor was basically what drove not just the American economy, but a lot of the European economy as well. And it used to be a very popular narrative, interestingly, but what I didn't know until I actually read this was that this was actually a narrative. Well, first off, it's a myth, but it was actually started by the Confederacy. And the reason the Confederacy started this was that they wanted support from Europe, notably Britain and France. So they basically told them, hey, if the Union continues to blockade us, we're not able to produce cotton and sell it to you, these economies are going to collapse. Now, ultimately, this was disproven by the war itself, because what happened? Well, England and France, they just got cotton from Egypt, from India, they turned to wool and other things, and obviously they made it through the war, and these countries all didn't collapse economically, so that alone disproves it. But then the other thing that Magness gets into, which is interesting here, is how they try to say apparently that that cotton made up half of the Southern economy, and now what's interesting though is the way they got this was to calculate GDP, you have to calculate the finished products. Like once everything is produced, then it's CIG, consumption, investment, government. But what they did to calculate cotton was they added up all the things associated with cotton. So they basically said it was 50% of GDP. In reality, it was probably closer to 5 or 10% of the Southern economy. Not irrelevant, obviously, but it wasn't most of the economy. And they made the comparison. I think Magness himself said it would be sort of like the equivalent of if you were to justify putting a sports stadium in the area, then associate any form of spending with the stadium as boosting the economy, which is disingenuous because it leaves out, okay, you have to take money from people to build that stadium, but it also, that money can be spent elsewhere anyway, so it's a wash. And again, he also, when they came up with this calculation, they didn't apply the same formula to everything else, so that's disingenuous. And then if you were to apply it to everything else, well, the economy would be a few times larger than it is, so it's a wash either way. And the original, let's see, was originally, this came from, who was it? Matthew Desmond, I think it was. And the scary thing was that this narrative about 50% of the economy, this was pushed repeatedly over and over. And it's one of those things like women earn 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. It just gets repeated endlessly and people don't examine where did this come from or why. And I have to look further into this, but one of my friends was telling me that apparently corn was a much more significant percentage of the economy than cotton was. Because you think about how much corn is in how many things. I mean, you have glucose, corn syrup, you eat corn directly, you feed it to livestock, corn starch. There's so many products, and that there was a book written, I haven't read it, but apparently it argues the role corn played in the economy, which is even larger than cotton. But corn was also grown in free states as well, so again, when you start delving further into this stuff, it all just starts falling apart. Did you have
And
any
also the
questions?
discrepancy could also have been in the direct could be the market. I mean, maybe corn had a lot bigger of a local in America
Yeah.
market, and also just the product. Cotton,
Yeah.
it's pretty clear to see this was cotton, and now it's a shirt. Now it's pants. Now it's sails for the boats, things like that. Whereas the cotton with the corn, I mean, is in foodstuffs, and they said derivatives for it, so it might not be as clear to see how the corn gets from all these other products. Maybe they also just didn't have as good of a lobbyist. There could be many things. We see that currently right now. There's certain industries that are not as, I don't want to say essential, maybe, or that is not as significant a part of the society, but they have a stronger lobbying aspect of it. They have a stronger footprint in society where people think this is more important and much bigger of a part of the industry of spending than something else. I think even something like military, I think it's something we can agree on, that the military, we have issues with the amount of spending in there, but most people just in general think that military spending is a lot higher than the social services. Yet it's not. It's not at all.
All you have to do is go to usdebtclock.org. It's all right there.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
this information is there. People just don't go to just like back in the times of the Civil War. I could understand it being more difficult to actually find the actual information on how much cotton is actually a part of the United States economy. But today, to have these misconceptions is surprising to me. I'm like, especially if you don't, if you, a lot of people don't care. A lot of people don't want to be involved in these topics. Don't want
No.
to discuss these topics. We're not going to get 20K views on this video in a day. But the ones who actually want to participate in this conversation, you have more access to information on this topic than we've ever had. So it's, to me, it's shocking and disappointing how little people actually inform themselves about this.
Well, it's also just as we've sort of surmised. It's also just what do people want to believe versus what the facts are. It's not, oh, I'm going to take a big picture view and see everything. It's I want this to be true for emotional reasons, so I'm going to go with the emotionally comfortable narrative and numbers that suit that purpose. It's sort of like
with the
the
King
pay
Cotton
gap thing I just mentioned now. I mean, that's been debunked countless times. There are people who still push it. It's one of those things. I mean, you can just Google gender pay gap debunked, and there's 100 things immediately that will all explain it. But there are people who still push that narrative because that's what they want to believe.
Yeah. So with this King Cotton thing, you said it didn't necessarily get the reaction that they wanted. They didn't end up, but they might have. They might have sent some things. It might have been the similar way people say, oh, the oil, like, oh, country finds oil. America thinks this country needs some democracy and sends the military over there.
Well,
I mean,
it's ironic in a way because it was pushed by the Confederacy to gain European support, but now it's become part of the reparations agenda as, oh, well, this is what built America. This is why we need reparations. But in reality, it doesn't hold up. And again, it was just pushed by the Confederacy for their own propagandistic purposes.
Are there going to be more? Are there going to be more critiques about that specifically? Because that's a topic that I am aware of. That I think many people might still be under the misconception of how much the slave trade actually contributed to the economy, and
Well,
it's just in general, when you oppress people in that way, you're not going to get the most results from whatever it is you're doing. It is a really crap way to do anything, to engage in that kind of slavery. Like anything pretty much is an improvement. Like you look at those industries right now, the amount of land that was being used to create that cotton through slavery being done with the 10 people and sharecropper, or 10 people with a tractor can do exponentially more from that actual amount of land. Look at the amount of food that's produced now by the percentage of the people in the world actually participating in that process of just planting, harvesting food compared to how it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Like
I think we mentioned in a previous video too, but there's the whole point about how it used to be 90-something% of the country worked in agriculture. Now it's like high single digits. It's like 8 or 9% or something. But the point is, because of industrialization and all that, okay, like you say, there's one guy gets on a tractor that has blades that cut through the cotton. That's it. You don't need an army of people to go out and pick it, and then you can free people up to do other things.
And this is not even that long ago. It's literally like right before the Industrial Revolution. It was just absurd. The amount of changes that have come. And when you hold something like slavery and you maintain something that is that negative to just, let alone the horrific actual aspect of what you're doing to humans, you're just not doing something effective even on your own. Even if you just had that same working process, but the people who you were enslaved could come and go, but still work in that process, it's just not a good way to do things. They go like, they take our jobs. Like, no, I want you to take my jobs. Like, I am trained in graphic design, animation, and there's certain things that I trained in with lower tech that now you could go on and create a website that's more effective after taking just a 10-minute, like a few hour course on the website than I had the ability to by working for 20 hours when I first took that course. Right. And that has made the world better. It's not worse. Sure, I may be out of certain work, but then now with my ability to do that in that one point, using that newer technology, I can still do some few things that you might not be able to do, or it frees me up to take that ability and learn some other new things. But this whole Luddite type of... It's
called the Luddite fallacy.
Anti-tech thing, or
somehow... Luddite fallacy.
Or this overestimation of just manpower. Like, no. I mean, just human beings. This our besides our mind is the only unique thing that's like, wow. But then everything created from our mind, the tools we make, and everything else is what makes us so successful, what leads to human flourishing. Being able to not have to use our physical bodies to do the things that we need to do to be top of the food chain on this space trip of ours.
Well, I bring up the Luddites just now because that was the same narrative that was pushed during this Industrial Revolution, that there were people who were destroying these new machines because they said, oh, they're going to put us out of work, they're going to take all our jobs. And of course, we saw the obvious end result of that no, the country industrialized, living standards went way up, people were freed up to do other things, and long run they ended up a lot better. But at the time, those people had the same fears. Oh no, we're going to be out of work, machines are going to do all the work, we're going to be out of work while the rich people just sit back and rake in the profits. And of course that didn't pan out. So
And that's still going on right now. There's still the fears of, automation's coming. We need to, we're taking jobs. No, bring that automation, bring them robots in. But yeah, okay. So that was King Kong. What's the next point?
Okay, so the next one, it's actually 2 points, but I'll sort of combine them. And it's an interesting thing because we talked about this in the last discussion, but how they tried to conflate capitalism with all sorts of economic systems that they didn't like. So, for example, they talk about capitalism, they bring up mercantilism. They talk about capitalism, they bring up slavery. They talk about capitalism, they bring up the economy in recent times. Again, capitalism is never clearly defined. And
so let's clearly define it here. When we're talking about capitalism, the free market capitalism, what is it that we're talking about? Because I think it's good to define at least what we have in mind versus why we're saying the things they're talking about doesn't necessarily fall into it.
Yes. And one of the points I'm trying to bring up, the larger points, is that they kept trying to conflate capitalism with slavery. But one of the points Magness and a few other people have really stressed is that a lot of the free market economists back then, Adam Smith, Jean-Baptiste Say, David Ricardo, all of those guys were anti-slavery. And then the reverse was true too. A lot of the pro-slavery defenders were anti-capitalist. And there's different quotes you can get into. For example, there's Adam Smith, who was an abolitionist. The people pushing for the free trade movement, you may know Britain had very high tariffs for a time, and then they repealed their corn laws, which lowered those tariffs and allowed for free trade. Though the people pushing for those were also people pushing for the end of slavery. So those causes were united. People wanted a free market in trading, but they also wanted slavery to end. And then you have people like Thomas Carlyle. I don't know if you know who he was, but he wrote an essay. I'm trying to remember what it was called. I think it was called the Negro Question or something like this. But basically, he was lamenting that slavery would end, and he was actually the one who coined the term economics is the dismal science, because he was lamenting, oh no, without slavery, we're not going to have an economy. And of course, he was proven wrong by history and by theorists, even at the time. But that was his narrative. And then there was another, one of the biggest advocates on the eve of the Civil War. His name was, let's see here, Fitzhugh was his last name. I'm trying to remember what his first name was, but he was a big follower of Carlyle, and he basically said he famously said we need to throw Adam Smith, say Ricardo and company into the fire. Basically, no, we have to completely dismiss these free market guys. They're our enemies. We have to keep slavery. And he said this on the eve of the Civil War, so that shows where the Confederacy was coming from. They were not free market capitalists at all.
Yeah, and with the capitalism, the key part of it, this free market capitalism we're talking about, is just when private ownership is the key aspect of it. The means of production are privately owned. The decisions of what's to be done is privately owned, and that comes from the initial aspect of humans have the ability to own property, starting with yourself. So slavery in and of itself, as we mentioned from before the discussion, you can't own another human being, let alone just directly have the ownership over everything they produce in that sense. So anything that has that kind of aspect where everything X person produces is you're taking ownership of that property and decide what to do with that, that is not an aspect of capitalism, at least in the sense that I learned what the term was actually supposed to be. But the way it's actually used is part of why I think we've both talked about this, how I'm starting to not use the term. If I say capitalism, I'll specifically say free market capitalism, but normally just talk about like free markets or things like that, because the term has just been bastardized. Like, you can't have that definition of capitalism and still say slavery is a part of capitalism. You just literally can't. Those two things can't coexist.
I'm trying to find it here for you, but there's a quote, or one of the historians of New Capitalism, they call it, actually said it's better we don't accurately define capitalism. He said that directly.
What would the reasoning for that be? Why would you want to keep
let me see. I'm trying to figure out where this is, but
this is not a necessarily new tactic, and be suspicious of people who are not willing to define certain things, or it's a spectrum. It's like, no, things can mean a thing, and then you can actually be that thing. When does that thing no longer that thing if it's never an actual thing? It's got to be something.
Oh yeah, here we go. So, who was it? Louis Hyman echoes these sentiments even more forcefully in a recent Journal of American History roundtable on the subject. Simply defining capitalism is a bad idea. It's too deductive. That's what he said. So when you tell me that, you're basically admitting to me that you're either spreading propaganda and or you're trying to avoid being pinned down on things. So you're just making up definitions as you go, so nobody can pin you.
Yeah, exactly. Like as we've mentioned, if you get into something, it comes to somebody and they make a statement, and if it's a one-on-one conversation, you probably just disengage. If it's some kind of public forum where somebody else might see and then they might benefit from seeing your interaction or how you deal with that, then you can maybe consider. But as we mentioned, if we're going to be on a field and we're actually trying to accomplish certain objectives in that field, we have to agree what those rules and guidelines and definitions are. Otherwise, get off the field. Okay, so was that the 2 points together, or is it a second point?
I wanted to combine them because basically he has two articles. One was called The Anti-Capitalist Ideology of Slavery. The other was How Capitalist Abolitionists Fought Slavery. And he, of course, gets more in-depth, explaining specific abolitionists who were free market and then the slavery defenders. He gets more in-depth. Of course, we recommend you read it directly, but I just wanted to summarize the broad points to make the overall point he was trying to make. All right, so next up, this section is called Fact-Checking the 1619 Project and Its Critics. This was a response to the historians who wrote into the New York Times. And he wanted to explain where the historians were right, and then there's one topic where they were a bit off base, but he elaborated on that. So Here's the first one. I touched on this briefly, I think, in the last discussion. But was the American Revolution fought in defense of slavery? Well, that falls apart on a number of grounds. For one, her Nicole Hannah-Jones, her basis for saying this was that there was a legal case in Britain in 1772 where a slave taken by his owner from the colonies to Great Britain could not legally be held against his will. Basically, the idea that England had never officially established slavery on the books in England itself. So the idea was that if a slave came back to England, they were free. And now that was basically what the trial was about. And the problem here, of course, there is a certain kernel of truth here. There were people who were in Britain who were saying, look, slavery is wrong and needs to go. But it wasn't so overwhelming that they were willing to let the slaves go in their colonies completely. And he goes on here to talk about how during the war itself, how there were British loyalists who owned and supported slavery, and then there were also Americans who opposed slavery as well. So it was more mixed. It wasn't the British were fighting to end slavery in the colonies; the Americans wanted to preserve it. And then he brings up some specific examples here. Let's see, there's Banastra Tarleton, who I mentioned last time. If you saw the movie The Patriot, the antagonist was based off of him.
Okay.
His father and grandfather owned merchant firms in Liverpool, which directly profiteered from slavery. And this guy was one of the higher-ranking British. I want to say he was a colonel, but he was a commander in the Dragoons. So he was very prominent. Then I think I brought it up last time, but the whole thing about Lord Dunmore, how he basically made the proclamation saying slaves that fight for the British will gain their freedom. But then Nicole Hannah-Jones leaves out that those were only slaves that fought for the rebels, that the loyalists were allowed to keep their slaves. So again, it's not. You look at that and then it's clear, okay, the British were not pushing to end slavery because it was, okay, let's turn the colonists' slaves against them, but then let's appease our own slave owners so that there's no slave uprising, or we're not going against their interests. And then finally, that other point, which I mentioned before, about how the colonies offered the Caribbean British colonies to join them, and they basically said, no, we're fine living under the British crown. And that's where the majority of slaves were. So if they didn't join the American Revolution, well, they clearly felt their slavery wasn't going to be threatened, so they had no reason to join the revolution. So, and that was actually something I didn't know until reading this. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then there's the bit about how later Dunmore, when he became governor of the Bahamas, he owned a lot of slaves and had them build a fortress for him. So, he wasn't some abolitionist either. He was just doing that for the sake of the war and trying to appease his masters.
Yeah, and that's the thing about this history. People sucked back then. If you met even the most well-respected or well-liked person from that time today, and you actually had a personal conversation with them, you would probably think they were a miscreant. You'd probably dislike this person greatly, because things change. We upgrade as a society, as a culture. Some things were taken for granted. People used to sell their children into slavery. There's people still today in countries in the world that sell their kids off into indentured servitude, into prostitution, into things like this. This is still happening. For people to be in the position that they are in United States of America, in many countries in the West, in some places in developing nations, in certain locations where you're living in a level of privilege and safety and comfort that's just unprecedented in human history. And you look at these things, anybody who talks about the good old days doesn't know about history. Like, just the most basic things in history were horrific. Just like horrible, horrible times. So these people were horrible people in general. In general, they were horrible people. When people look at this and they point out at certain specific things about them and say, this is negative about this person, but compared to what? Who else at that time was doing so much better? Were your ancestors somehow so much better? And as you mentioned, with talking about the different things in the United States of America, with the slavery and the Brits being called in, the initiation of this, there was no United States of America. It was the British Empire doing this. And then they established different colonies, and they had their own little governments doing those things. And there was both sides. There was people on either sides of the things, because people come to different awakenings, come to different upgrades, and come to different thoughts at different levels. The same way I'm against some people, mostly in the South, right, in the identitarian side, who say, well, the Brits are the ones who fought all over the world to undo slavery. I'm like, yeah, but they also were the ones who were like doing the most slavery for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's not like it was the entire British government that changed. It was no, the British Empire was also fighting other people within the British Empire who wanted it to continue. So I'm not going to hold the entire British Empire guilty of slavery, but I'm also not going to ignore all the things. And then because there was a small percentage of them that did lead the abolishment of slavery around the world, I'm not going to put praise onto the entire British Empire because of that small minority that did that.
Right.
And that's the same thing when I'm telling the people of the 1619 Project. Yes, some of the founding fathers did this. Yes, there was people in the United States of America that fought for this. But I'm not going to damn the entire country for it, just like I wouldn't damn every single black person in Chicago for the current protests and riots that are going on, people breaking into the place.
Right.
So if I'm not going to hold somebody accountable for what a few ancestors did hundreds of years ago, I'm also not, because I don't hold you literally accountable right now for somebody, your cousin might have been out there, but I'm not going to hold you responsible. I'm not even going to hold maybe the kid's parents, maybe it's something to do with how they raised the kid, or the kid looting and things like that. But the cousin who's maybe like met them at a few barbecues, and like, how am I going to hold that responsible on you? So that's my thought on this thing, and it's a mixed bag. That's why I have problems when they make those statements, point out one part of it, and then focus on that one part. It's the same negativity that resulted in the dehumanization that could hold the slavery thing. They pointed out certain aspects of black people at that time and used that to dehumanize them and ignored all the actual other human aspects of these people. And that's when we get to these major issues of dehumanizing people, because we don't take them for the whole complicated being that they are.
Right.
Yeah. All right.
So the next point.
One of those related to the actual topic.
So the next point I'm going to bring up here, this was Lincoln a racial colonizationist or exaggerated egalitarian? And this is interesting because this is something that Phil Magness himself has actually done work, and he's unearthed some new documents on this, because Lincoln is always a contentious figure because he's one of those that he's either completely revered or he's really demonized. It's hard to get a very fair and balanced take on it. And what I like about Phil Magness is I think he has a very nuanced take on Lincoln, where he acknowledges, okay, he did a lot of draconian stuff during the war itself, but at the same time, a lot of what he did ultimately had a better effect, as far as obviously it was a constitutional amendment that freed the slaves, but of course it started with the Emancipation Proclamation and other things. And there's a very good article of his, I can send it to you, you may have seen it before, I liked, where it's called What Should Libertarians Think About the Civil War? And I thought it was interesting because there are a lot of libertarians, many of whom I like, by the way, who sort of side with the Confederacy during the Civil War. And the reason for that is the justification is they were fighting a just war because they were throwing off a government that didn't represent them. So they were essentially claiming their own right to self-determination. But then, of course, you see the obvious problem with that. Well, slavery and the fact that in the state's secession documents, a lot of them explicitly say, even sometimes in the first few sentences, we're seceding because of slavery. We're thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. So that's obviously, you can't claim the moral high ground with that. But then the other side of it is that the Union, of course, was not a libertarian utopia either. I mean, Lincoln locked up judges, he censored telegraph lines, he shut down newspapers, mail was intercepted, he authorized total war against Atlanta, and there were probably other things too if I looked into it, but the point Magnus was trying to make is that the Civil War, like a lot of things, you can't see it as this Manichaean struggle of good versus evil. You have to realize, okay, there was plenty of good and bad on both sides. I mean, there were people on the Confederate side who were opposed to slavery. I mean, they've talked about that with Robert E. Lee. He fought because Virginia seceded. And there were other people who just saw it as, it was actually James McPherson who was one of the people writing this critique that was sent to the New York Times, where he cited different letters from Confederate veterans, and some of them actually said, we're basically fighting against a government that we feel doesn't represent us. Now, obviously you can get into the merits of, does that mean you're defending slavery too? But they didn't see it as, oh, I'm fighting for my right to own black people. It's more, I'm fighting for my own right to self-determination. Again, doesn't mean the Confederacy were the good guys, but I think Magnus and others, they take that more nuanced approach of, okay, like you just said, you can't hold all these people on one side accountable for a certain thing. Like you can't say everyone in the North was responsible for suspension of habeas corpus and all that. And at the same time, I mean, there was a lot of racism in the North too. So again, it's not a black and white thing. Both were very gray. It was just a question of, I guess, how dark or light gray.
Yeah, and that's the thing with politics. It's one thing I also try to wonder when I look at people who, I mean, when I started getting a lot more involved and interested in studying the actual world of politics, which was maybe about a decade ago or a little less. Before, I was kind of apathetic about it. If you thought about my worldview, I think it was a lot more towards what people consider liberal leftists right now. It's more like socialists to the kind of things like, oh, what exactly are taxes? But you start looking into these things, and I really quickly started realizing how artificial it was. Like we had this conversation, I think, at some time back, where we like realized that, at least for me and you, I think right now we watch politics like most people watch sports or follow like Marvel comics, like getting in like the spoiler material, trying to see what's happening this season, like who are the characters. It's like teams, there's ideologies, there's prizes to win, there's like Super Bowls, there's different things.
Yeah.
Where I see the artifice, I see the political theater of it. And to me, the stakes are a lot more important than any sport. It's a lot more riveting and real, and the emotions are involved that no Hollywood production could ever actually put in. The amount of money that's invested in changing these things is more than any kind of entertainment industry or any other kind of industry that you see out there. And it's about, but it's still as artificial in some cases. It's still as much of what is practical versus what can actually be done. This is one thing that I learned quite early as I was learning my graphic design and animation. I remember doing some animation and having some ideas in my mind and doing like gradients and all these other things, and the amount of time to take to publish it, the technology you had, the computing power. There were certain limitations on what I wanted to say with the actual tools that I had. And that's the same thing with politics. People look at politicians and I wonder, what are you expecting from these people? Why do you expect certain results? Don't you get that they're saying things just to say them? Because it's about what's practical. If the United States of America was established at that time, could they literally have just abolished slavery at that time?
No.
I don't think it would have worked. They had certain practical things about it, and I read this different article that was making the case that there was certain dispensations in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that opened the way for down the line for slavery to be abolished. And I think there was Frederick Douglass was speaking on that as well. I'll try to remember to actually leave a link for that.
It's interesting too, because Douglass actually called the Constitution a great liberty document.
Yeah.
Douglass is one of those that's kind of interesting because, like Lincoln and a lot of other figures, like everyone tries to say he's on their side. He obviously was critical of the system at the time. I mean, he was a slave who escaped and then educated himself and came back. So obviously he had a lot to criticize, all of course being valid, but at the same time, he seems to have still believed in the founding ideals and said, look, this country can live up to what it promised. It's going to be a struggle to get there. And I think that message sort of gets lost because like we keep saying, you have all these people today that complain, oh, things aren't perfect. But even he at the time, having been an actual slave, said, yes, things are bad. This country has a ways to go, but I do think it's possible. He had a certain optimism overall, and he was willing to fight for it. Oh, so getting back to Lincoln, the whole thing about the colonization, he actually got that idea from his mentor, Henry Clay. Henry Clay, I always say he was kind of like Ted Kennedy. Like, he never became president, but he had all these high up offices and tried to be president. And Clay had the idea of the colonization idea that after the slaves were free, they'd all be sent back to Africa, notably Liberia. That was originally the plan. And
yes.
Yeah, it is. And the idea was, the debate with Lincoln was, did Lincoln really support this? And apparently Magness himself had a role in discovering that Lincoln supported this even up to his dying day. And what's interesting is, I don't know if you know who Henry Louis Gates is. He was the guy behind The Roots. He actually came into my job. I've met him a few times. He actually gave Magness praise for this work, which I thought was kind of cool because, they're the types, they probably disagree on a lot of things, but he was still willing to say, look, you did a good job here. And what Magness is saying, this is probably maybe one of the only areas where the project is actually more accurate than its critics. That no, Lincoln did support this stuff up until his dying day, but because Lincoln has been so deified in American culture that a lot of people don't want to accept that about him, and a lot of people have sort of bought into this whitewash view of Lincoln rather than seeing the whole bigger picture.
Did you see the movie with Daniel Day-Lewis? I haven't watched it. I really like that actor, but I haven't watched that movie
Lincoln?
where he played Lincoln. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
What was your take on it? Do you think it was good? They give some different.
It's one of those movies that, again, it was kind of whitewashed. In the book that Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote did seem like it was kind of whitewashed too. I thought it was very good as far as acting. He did a great job, of course. Tommy Lee Jones basically stole the show. I thought it was well done in the sense it was interesting, but was it the most accurate movie? Probably not. No.
Okay.
Like, for example, I was thinking of even that bit they show in the previews where his wife, played by Sally Fields, he talks about, oh, nobody's loved by the people as you, when in reality, no, Lincoln was one of the most hated presidents during his lifetime. And there's actually a good book on this. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called The Unpopular Mr. Lincoln, and it was written by a guy, I'm trying to remember the author's name off the top of my head, but it's interesting because he explained writing the book, he actually felt bad for Lincoln after, because he got into how he barely won his election, that they tried to assassinate him more than once, that at the end of the war, of course, everyone was angry with him, the South, because the slaves were freed. North, it's, well, how many lives were lost and how much was destroyed. So it only became later, and he explains that the New England clergy, when Lincoln died, that's when he became deified, and people compared him to Moses, leading the people to the promised land but not making it there himself. They compared him even to Jesus. Oh, he died for America's sins the way Christ died for ours. But he explains that this was sort of an after the fact thing. After Lincoln died, this narrative was really pushed. But in his own lifetime, he wasn't viewed so positively. And again, it's interesting. Oh, Larry Tagg, that's the author's name, and it's interesting because, again, Tagg is not some neo-Confederate, as they say, or whatever. He actually liked Lincoln, and he actually felt bad for him writing this book, but I thought it was interesting because it's one of those books that really goes against the conventional narrative, but you still get the impression he's being very accurate in his telling.
Yeah, and that's one thing that, as I mentioned, I'm not going to deny. If you actually, history in general has been massaged and changed around. These whole things of the way people are taught about certain beings is not that accurate. And part of the negativity of that is most kids are put through a state schooling system, and the state is not going to be quite honest about the actual origins of the state. They're going to want to massage things in a positive sense. And I don't want to throw that out and then just switch in a different form of indoctrination with this whole like, oh, it was all these people were negative. Now we have this kind of oppressive type of situation. Like, no, the state is oppressive enough as is without adding all these other like shenanigans onto it, because that's going to distract us from actually combating the actual negative parts of the nature of that beast, where you put into situations where you have to make these decisions. Should I free these people? Should I send these people to go kill all these people because these people might be freed? Is it time for us to actually do these things because we actually have control over this economy and we have police people who are actually guarding and catching these slaves and bringing them back in because we have decided to control this economy where we're giving incentives to this aspect that's using the slave labor? And that's a similar thing that's occurring now. Yeah. Why are so many things being done in China? Why are so many people like the NBA using sneakers that are in China? Why is Hollywood making films that are tied towards it? Why are people doing these things if people dislike the things that are being done in China? The average American is not supportive of the working conditions that most Chinese people in other countries are going through in order to give them certain goods that they have. I think if they were aware about that, they've already shown that they don't want it for themselves. Yeah. I don't think they want it for other people either. Like, you see this thing being shifted to other countries. Oh, we want clean factories. Yeah. But we don't mind if you have a dirty factory somewhere in Africa and then you ship those goods here. Like, if you just...
But those are also the same people who complain about outsourcing. Oh, all these jobs are being outsourced. Oh, but I don't want dirty factories down the road. You can't have all of it at once. Yeah.
And that's a give and take right there. And that is, I think it's because of that coercive state type of situation. If you bring down liberty, you bring down the people where people can make those decisions more on themselves and decide instead of saying, oh, I'm going to pick this one person to make these decisions for this massive group of people. Take that decision onto yourself, and I think you'll result in a better kind of world. But yes, so the stuff with Lincoln, that's quite interesting. Yeah. So that is one thing. There's a series by the Mises Institute about the Civil War that goes into more details about different things. It's like a multi-part series that's pretty interesting, that if anyone wants to check that out, I think that's good as well. And you said, I think, yeah, the Civil War, that is something that is very big. Most people don't really understand what went on with that thing. And there was also no guarantees. Like, what if the South won?
Well, it's also interesting too, because Magness himself has sort of pushed back against some of the people at Mises Institute. I mean, I think they're on good terms, but he's making the point about how people there and elsewhere, including Murray Rothbard, who I'm obviously a huge fan of, but how certain people, it seems like they try to downplay the slavery issue, like they say, oh, the South seceded because of tariffs and all that. But again, if you look at the secession documents, you listen to the Cornerstone speech, they're explicit. I mean, Alexander Stephens, the vice president, says, this is the cornerstone on which this nation is built. I mean, he's not mincing his words or anything. And I think the trap that some libertarians fall into, and I include myself in this, is that I think we sort of have this desire to be contrary. So we sort of wonder, like, okay, yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, what weren't we told in school? Oh, how were things really? The Gnostic view of history, I think some people have called it. It's, this is how things really went. Oh, everything you got was propaganda. And of course, reality is, like again, go back to David Irving, it's the same thing with him. It's like, yeah, he may have good insights, but at the same time, there are lies and errors in his work. And it's, again, you're just trading one form of propaganda for another. And are you really better off? Or can we just take a bigger picture view and decide, okay, what actually happened? That's the whole issue.
That is key. And that's the thing. We might also be projecting from the schools that we went to or from the extra research that we've done. Because some of the things I'm looking back in history, like, I don't know, when did I really know this information? If I had just gotten what I learned in school and then was cut off, my idea of Abraham Lincoln would be entirely different than what the reality actually is. Then we also project into current year, and we look at some of the animosity and things like that, like against Trump, and we're like, this is the worst time ever. Trump has been through a lot. And I will admit, it has, even just recent comparison, but the amount of access, if Abraham Lincoln had Twitter, what would it be like? I think there's also this interesting short of somebody during the start of the German occupation, I think, of Poland. They did a small short vignette, I think it was like 10 minutes or so, about, let's say Instagram and Twitter existed at that time. And it was done in like a period piece with like cars of that time, outfits of that time, the kind of lifestyle. But it was like from a few people who were just Instagramming it and tweeting what was happening as the Germans were coming and taking over the thing. And it was interesting to see that kind of what would the reaction be from people around the world. So imagine if an Abraham Lincoln had a Twitter, had an actual
I just thought about
you
now,
could see people's reactions to him.
Look how much he aged during the war. Like they talk about at the end of the war, he looked 10 years older than he did maybe a year or two ago. And all the heat he was getting, not just obviously his opponents, the Confederacy, but also from people in his own party. They called them the Copperheads. That was the Democrats up north. So he had enemies on all sides, basically. And then at the same time, I know he had lost a son. His wife was going crazy. I know that. So it's just all that he was under. I mean, it's like, how do you not, the stress is going to kill you in some way, it would seem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was different. So we don't really have that good of a comparison to say about the things. I think with Obama, there might have been some kind of thing where people felt the same white guilt type of thing that exists now, where you can't speak out against certain things. Might have been something where a lot of people held back certain critiques they would have had over the 8 years prior to Trump, that like now they feel they can like project and critique a lot of things that they were like, oh, if I say this about Obama would be like talking bad about the first black president. This is something I kind of thought of. There might have been some pent up need to critique somebody that wasn't there, because the general premise that you see of the groups that can be critiqued, the protected groups, that is not something new. That's something that has existed for quite some time. And I think we're just seeing it in a different expression in current year.
Well, it was interesting too. I was watching recently. It was today actually that Ben Shapiro was talking to different people about cancel culture and comedy, and he had some interesting conversations. That he actually had Larry Wilmore on his show, which I actually commended, because I mean he and Wilmore probably don't agree on anything, but they were willing to have a conversation. And it was funny because Shapiro goes, "Okay, I have a conservative critique of comedy," and Wilmore's kind of like, "Why is it a conservative critique?" And he's like, "Well, listen to why, and I'll explain." He goes, "Comedy has just been one-sided." He's like, "You go on these late night shows, it's just Trump, 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 Trump all the time." And he goes, "How many of these people made jokes about Obama? Virtually none, or if they did, it was kind of like a backhanded compliment." And he made the point how if you look at people like Johnny Carson or Leno or Letterman, I think Letterman was left-leaning. I don't know about the other two, but they would make fun of both sides. And I remember, when Bill Clinton was having affairs, there were all those jokes about that. They made fun of Bush. Like they did make fun of both sides, but now it's just, with these comedians, it's just Trump all the time, and it's usually the same jokes. And he was saying this is why they've lost a lot, because it's that combined with the fact that, you're not supposed to criticize certain groups, and it just limits what you can do, and then it just becomes preaching to the choir. And a few people have pointed out, if you notice with a lot of these comedians, people don't even laugh; they just applaud, meaning it's just, this confirms what I want to believe. So it's lost. It limits what they can do, and it's really hurt the talent. And whereas it used to be, you'd actually hear uproarious laughter because it actually was funny. And again, you could make fun of different groups, different people on both sides, and it made comedy a lot more interesting. It's just, they've really ruined it that way.
That is a good point that I really haven't thought about, but now that you bring it up, I think I'll be noticing it a lot more. Yeah. Is the reaction in comedy shows. Yeah. How often do you feel like clapping versus laughing? That is a reaction to a different sort of emotion. Yeah. Like you're never watching a sports game and then somebody scores a winning goal or scores a point. You don't think of laughing. You clap because you feel your team has done something positive against the opposing team. But in comedy, it's supposed to be laughing, not clapping. Yeah. That is a good point.
Well, it's funny because I've made fun of her a bit, and one of my friends and I sort of make fun of her too. But like Sarah Silverman, we were talking about how if you ask a lot of her guy fans, what do you like about her, they'll indirectly say she's hot. And one of my friends was noticing. One of my friends is noticing too. If you watch a lot of her routines, you may hear a little bit of laughter, but it's usually light clapping at most. It's like, it's never like uproarious laughter, and it's like, what does that say?
Her stand-up, I never really liked her stand-up that much, but her Sarah Silverman show was great. That was a fantastic show. It's unfortunate that she felt the need to come out and apologize for that show, because I think that was a really excellent piece of television. Like the way it was scripted, it was off the wall, just type of, you couldn't really expect some of the things that are happening. Like, that's going to happen. And like, no, something else off the wall happens. It was really a good show. I think she did a really amazing job of comedy on that one. She has that mind of thinking and planning and the things, but her stand-ups kind of fell flat on me. And then, of course, now what she's morphed into is quite another creature.
Well, it's the same thing with Jimmy Kimmel. Yeah. Like, the guy came to fame on what's that? It's the same thing with Kimmel though. Like, he came to fame on the Man Show. I mean, girls on trampolines and all that, and then now he's all about woke and everything, and that's pretty much why. I know he was struggling, but then I don't think his show got canceled, but what is he, suspending it or something? Because it became, now they're bringing back all this stuff he did and using it against him, trying to cancel him. And of course he's getting defensive, but somebody like me, I don't have sympathy, because my reasoning is, well, okay, you made all this money on offensive humor, and then when it became trendy to be woke in certain circles, all of a sudden you sold out and pandered, and then now they're coming back to you, and it's like, oh, come on, leave me alone. It's, you thought you could appease people, they'd leave you alone, but no, they don't work that way.
And that's the thing we were trying to understand. Where does this come from? Whereas when Oprah is speaking about things like this, you're like, what? Oprah is speaking on this? Like, of course, we talked about LeBron James before, but some of these people, then with the Man Show thing, you look at the different paths that Adam Carolla took versus Jimmy Kimmel. Like Adam Carolla has a podcast now, and he still appears in things. He writes books. He did some documentary with Dennis Prager. I'm like, I don't really like Prager because it was religious stuff, but he's taken a completely different take, and you don't see shots being taken at Adam Carolla because people understand there's like you take the shots, he's not even going to notice them. He's going to be like, oh, whatever, take your shots. Like, go ahead. Like
well, he stuck to his principles, and I mean, obviously, I don't have anywhere near the reach someone like he does, but I've sort of seen this with myself too, where people sort of leave me alone because it's okay. This person's set in their ways; they're not going to change. I'm not going to try to argue. Whereas, what I've learned is that as soon as you bend the knee, that's when they come after you. Because then it's, oh, we can get them to do this, we can get them to apologize, we can get them to do what we want, and it just long run, they end up destroying you anyway because they're not really about helping people. They're just about claiming scalps as victory badges, basically.
Yeah, but with that, you see, even with something like the 1619 Project, I still don't really understand what their point was. It's America was founded on slavery, and then what?
Yeah.
What follows from that? What should follow from that?
Well, and I'll get to this in the next point as well. But it's the whole point about did slavery drive America's economic growth? And we touched on this a little bit last time, but the whole point about where did the majority of slaves go? They went to the Caribbean and Brazil. Mm-hmm. I think, what was it for? I have to look at those charts.
Let's ask again before if you haven't watched the last one. Let's ask this question right now because this is something that I think we talked about that I'm rather certain about. How many slaves during the entire slave trade were brought from West Africa and the Atlantic slave trade to the United States of America specifically, and were put in plantations and slavery on the continental United States of America? It became the United States of America before it ended, became after. How many? Was it 10 million, 4 million, 1 million, or 400,000? Which one do you think? Before you answer, just take some time and give some thoughts if you haven't heard the number. What's the number?
So,
say the number.
It's 400,000.
Yes, and that's the thing. Like we are pretty certain that most people who haven't actually found the actual number and seen the historical number would likely pick about 4 million. I think that's what most people would go with. I don't think people would go with 10 million, but most people would think 4 million. And now I think when you think about the United States of America, to me, when somebody talks about blacks, to me, I think it's specifically American descendants of slaves, like the ADOS. And there's a group that actually is more direct with admitting that. Whereas if I moved to the United States of America and became an American citizen, and then I had kids, would my kids be black? I don't think they would technically fall into that because I don't have that history of it. My kids have history from this village in Kakamega in Western Kenya, because that's where my folks came from, in Luyaland. That's where their direct history is from. So at most, they would be African Americans, just as African American as Elon Musk is, but they wouldn't be black. Just like Elon Musk's kids are not black because he has descendancy from Africa, but he is African American. And I think, of course, with the added aspect, you have to also have the Negro gene somehow, of some percentage, whether you want to one-drop rule it or otherwise. Yeah. And with that being said, I don't consider Barack Obama to be black because his father has closer history to my parents. They're the Luya tribe and the Luo tribe, which Barack Obama Sr. from, is in the same Western Kenya. They're neighboring tribes, so it's probably battles between the two of them. But he has that African. He's African American, definitely partially African American, first African American president, but black, not an ADOS. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
So yeah, but that bears worth repeating those numbers because, again, people, if you're going to say the slaves built the country, then you have to make the case, well, if 40% of the slaves went to Brazil should be a few times wealthier than us. And then the majority of those, aside from that, went to the Caribbean. Again, you look at the Caribbean today, there are wealthy areas, but those countries are not economic powerhouses. I mean, many of them are poor, in fact. Mm-hmm. And as I said last time, this is not to denigrate what anyone went through. Obviously, anyone in slavery is bad, but it's just making the logical argument of this country was built by slaves, it had the fewest slaves, well, by that logic, these other countries should be much wealthier. And there are some other things I sent you too, which I found pretty interesting that I didn't know about until I got into this via Magness, but how there's actually an inverse correlation between states that had slaves and their income that exists to this day. It's a negative correlation. For example, Mississippi had several millionaires, but today it's the poorest state in the Union. Back then it was still poor too. Massachusetts and Connecticut freed their slaves much earlier. They were wealthier states back then, still two of the wealthiest states today. And again, if you're going to make the case, well, slavery drove economics, again, why isn't it reversed? Why isn't Mississippi super wealthy and then Connecticut and Massachusetts are poor? So that on itself doesn't make sense. And then again, I mean, I think you could point to Virginia. Virginia, of course, was a wealthy state for a long time, but some of these other southern states, deep south, I mean, there were millionaires there. Obviously, there were people who became extremely wealthy off this, but the population at large did not. So,
yeah, and that's another key thing to see. How widespread was the wealth? This is that same thing where people look at the top 1% and somehow ignore the majority of the people in whichever group. And this happens with both of the people who say we are the 99%. Because if you live in the United States of America, congratulations, you are in the top 1% of the world.
Yeah.
In pretty much every kind of significant aspect. So while you're in the United States of America, looking at the top 1% of your society and saying, look at what those people are doing and ignoring the other 99% of your society, realize you're also ignoring 99% of the world that is in general doing a lot worse than what you're doing. So that's definitely a clear thing that's there. And as you mentioned with the numbers, that's one thing that I don't think I've known that for a while, with the whole inverse relationship with that thing. And I didn't know necessarily why, because I wasn't as much into econ and just the general things like the non-aggression principle and the violation of people's private property and their self-ownership. And that's an inherent part of it. So you are not going to be effective. You're going to get addicted to that kind of drug of using and abusing people, that you're not going to find better ways of doing things, that once that drug is cut off, you're going to have that stunted and mutated and disfigured economy, and you're going to be like, what are we going to do now? And to adjust to the new things is going to take some time.
And to be clear, I mean, before anyone says anything, this doesn't apply to every single state. I mean, Texas is still a wealthy state, but then you have to ask, okay, they were explicitly a slave state. I think the last slaves were actually freed in Texas. But at the same time, you have to ask, well, why is Texas wealthy today? Well, look at all their oil wealth. Virginia, Fairfax County, Virginia is the wealthiest county in the country, but you have to ask why. Well, that's where all the lobbyists live. So there you go. Mm-hmm. California, 8th or 9th largest economy in the world. California was I think being added around the time of the Civil War. So, but it was a free territory. So it's not a perfect correlation what I'm saying for every single state, but broadly speaking, it holds true. And the question again, it's, I like the Latin ceteris paribus, all things being equal. Okay, well, what other factors would go into making these areas wealthy aside from slaves? And then one other point too, I had sort of learned this a few months ago. I meant to mention it in the last discussion, but I forgot that the number of Europeans enslaved by the Barbary pirates in North Africa, they estimated it was between 1 to 1.25 million. So you figure that's 2 to 3 times the number of Africans enslaved. So again, by that logic, why isn't North Africa all super wealthy? Again, there's other reasons for that, like Libya being bombed and so on. But if you're going to make that case, well, the Ottoman Empire, the African slave trade, plus that, they should be a few times wealthier than they are. So
look at the trans-Saharan slave trade from East Africa going to the Middle East. That's not why Dubai is building the tallest structure in existence. It's not because they had slaves that they castrated and kids that they killed, the concubines. It's hundreds of years ago, for a lot longer than the transatlantic slave trade. It's no, slavery is not profitable for everyone involved. Now this is just iffy stuff, but somehow they did some kind of test or something. This might have been social sciences. I don't know how exactly they figured this thing. I'll see if I can, let me take a note to see if I can find the actual studies that did this. Slave master psychology, just the psychology that somebody has when you enslave somebody, it slowly eats away at your just well-being. Like
Yeah.
we look at some of these things, you just walk around and you look at some of the horrible things people do. Even just you look at the looting. I think with some of the reason some people who are well-meaning on the political left who just disbelieve some of the things said about some of the bad people out there in the world, and also have that visceral hate about because of the negative things that are said about Trump that they take for granted, because these are things that it's hard to imagine actually being actually racist. It's hard to imagine really not caring about somebody in a horrific situation. It's hard to imagine trying to actually harm somebody's ability to get access to healthcare. So these kind of things are things that people find it hard to imagine. So I think even if you try to dehumanize this other human being, once you have those slaves in your plantation, and you see them day to day, you see them cry, you see them have emotions, you see them have families, you see them have those involuntary reactions that you see in your children, you can't maintain that fallacy that this is not a human being for long. It's going to start breaking away your psyche, and they have supposedly shown. You can see this with I think the what's this? There's a spokes trial, and there's some kind of trials where they show with like the people who are prisoners. The mentalities you have to get into to be able to maintain being a slave owner for that amount of time. Like right now, if I just told 9.99% of the people in the world, here's a slave, here's somebody you can enslave, they would not do it just because of the mental anguish that would go onto it. And people were still humans back then. And eventually people started learning those things. Like the amount of people that can actually enslave people and just be happy with it are just the small group of psychopaths and sociopaths that exist. And that's such a small percentage of the world population that slavery is not good for anybody involved in it. Anybody.
Well, there was a good scene too in one of the Assassin's Creed games, Black Flag, where one of these characters you have to assassinate, he's a Dutch slave trader, and he's talking to a Spanish, I don't know if he's a governor of an island, I forget which, but they're sort of talking about the way they viewed the slaves, and it was interesting because it shows how they were struggling with this, where on the one hand, the Dutch guy basically says, oh, well, they're just animals, we can do what we want with them, but then the Spanish guy says, well, we have to convert them to Christianity, we'll save their souls. But then at the same time, the belief was, well, animals don't have souls, so what soul is there to be saved? And there was sort of that contradiction there where it's like, okay, are these people and are we redeeming them? And I think when people started moving towards abolition, that was more the attitude, like, no, these are human beings, they deserve rights. We should just extend them as they deserve them. But then the argument before that is, well, these are animals. But then it's like, okay, you see these people, they can speak, they can think for themselves. Obviously, they don't act like animals. So again, like you say, what went into the psychology of that, where they had to basically just either be in denial or they had to come up with insane rationalizations to justify doing this.
That is one thing I think about with the United States of America, that people need to realize, like, it's amazing what the United States of America is. Value and appreciate the exceptional things about your culture. Think about the way dogs are treated in America. Think about how Michael Vick was, the reaction to Michael Vick after he was involved with that like dog fighting ring. Think about the average way a pet is treated in America versus a place like China where they still eat dogs.
Yeah.
A place like here in Kenya where,
Korea,
okay,
too.
people don't have pets that much. The pet culture isn't that big. But you'll see people in the United States of America caring for like the state of gorillas in the Congo, yet the people in the Congo don't give two damns about those gorillas.
No.
They're just like, whatever, these gorillas. But somebody in the United States of America will care about it. I just did like a post, kind of a joke post, thinking about like, if you keep a pet in the United States of America while knowing that there's homeless humans who don't have food, that's some kind of white privilege, some kind of like self-hating kind of human things. But no, that whole aspect, I think people should kind of think of that and realize that there is something about the United States of America and the West and Enlightenment ideals that have gotten where humans, the human being itself, is one of the few species that cares that much for other life forms, entirely separate species that technically have nothing actually positive to give to your direct life. But you're actually going to care for it just for the sake of caring for it. So when you have this dehumanization, when you have people look at, oh, the blacks, oh, the Latinx, oh, the gays, or this, I'm like, you're taking away the individual qualities of these beings and looking at them, oh, the dogs, oh, the gorillas. Like it's a dehumanization aspect instead of like, this is my pet. His name is Jim. Jim does this in the morning. Like there seems to be more of an anthropomorphization of inanimate things and other life forms with some groups than there is for just individual humans. That seems to be some kind of misfiring or some twisting of things that I consider positive.
One of the points that's come up a lot, and they've talked about some of our, I would call them, I guess, intellectual villains like Rousseau or Marx, some of those people, is that they claim to have this great love of humanity, but it doesn't actually show up in their relationships. Like they talk about Rousseau had, I think, something like 5 kids. He threw them all in an orphanage where most of the kids died and just left them to rot. Marx, of course, there's the famous story about how he impregnated his maid, threw her out. Apparently the kid looked a lot like him too, but he basically disowned the kid. So of course, there are tears and pity for, oh, these poor workers, all this. But then you look at how they treat people that they personally know, and there's really no care or concern. And it's just, you have this love of humanity in the abstract. And I see this with people who I've debated, how they seem to love humanity as like an abstract concept. But then if you look at their day-to-day life, oh, I hate people. Oh, I hate people. I don't care about these people. It's like, do you actually care about people, or just virtue signaling for brownie points?
Yeah, that aspect of the nihilism of it's really I really detest that. I'm just like, no, if you don't like people, let's not have this conversation, because I'm team human above everything else. Like if you somehow convince me that every single life form on Earth had to die right now for 10 humans to live, maybe not 10, maybe like 1,000,000, I'd be like, yeah, okay, do it. Like, I don't know, but if let's say it was us versus them, it's team us all the way. It's not even a question. I don't have to think about it twice. Like, because on top of that, we could bring them back. Human beings are literally at the cusp of bringing back life forms that are extinct. Yeah, we can do that. The gorillas can't. The anteaters can't. All these other animals that are going extinct that we haven't even actually. This is a question that I had. I asked this a separate thing. How many species do you think humans have actually identified versus how many species actually are predicted to actually exist or are theorized to actually exist in the world? It's something like we've only identified like 1.5 million, but there's actually supposedly about 8 million. So there's species that are coming into existence and dying off without us even like ever knowing about it, but supposedly humans are destroying the world. No, we're the ones who are actually going to bring back some of those species. We're the ones who are actually going to take some of those species and put them on other planets all over the solar system, all over the galaxy. Or maybe an asteroid could just come and smash us, and then somehow to be like locked into like some asteroid that goes and lands. That could happen too. But if it's a more if it's a more intentionally done way of seeding other planets, we could seed Earth on other Earth life forms from Earth on other planets. We're the ones who are going to do that. Okay. So are we done with that point? Or we still have more?
And just to sort of close out, I mean, more broadly, I would say if you want to look at why America became wealthy, you have to, again, factor in all the bigger picture stuff. Very low taxation, immigration was more lax, but there was also no welfare state. There were tariffs, unfortunately, but there was a lot of freedom as far as you could just save up money and start a company, all that. There are some natural resources, but again, I think bigger picture, if you want to look at why a country like America became wealthy, you have to look at all those factors rather than just say, well, they had slaves, because again, so did everyone else. Everyone else isn't a superpower. So that's a whole topic in of itself, and I don't want to derail, but like broadly speaking, I think people should at least ask those questions.
Yeah.
So
we can have a separate one. Come back and talk about that. That's a deep topic. I think we'll talk about.
So this next one, and this is a real kicker here, did the 1619 Project seek adequate scholarly guidance in preparing its work? That's a very important point. And one of the things, this is one of the things that Magness really came down hard on them for, where he says they used a opaque, quote-unquote, fact-checking process, and they used, quote-unquote, selective transparency. And one of the complaints here is that he offered to talk to Nicole Hannah-Jones about, what are some of the issues with this? I think this needs further examination. She basically refused. He said, look, we can meet in person. I'm happy to discuss this with you. I'm not going to broadcast anything. But, she said no. And then the other thing, too, with the new historians of capitalism, they never really talk to anyone outside of their own circle. So again, that's always suspect in my book, because if you have the stronger case, get out there, debate the ideas, make the point, and then, okay, you'll win people over. But if it's, we're only going to talk to a few people that all say the same thing, I mean, how is that really scholarship? Also, too, they criticize Magness as well for his credentials, because they're like, oh, he's an economic historian, not a historian specializing in this area. But he makes a point. Who do you guys cite as sources? Journalists, sociologists. So it's the same criticisms usually made at them. And you may have seen it, but there's even a chart that shows a list of all the people. I think there are a few historians, but it's mostly journalists and sociologists. It's not specialist historians.
That's one of the appeal to authority thing is one of the fallacies that's very odd to me, because they'll say, I'm not an expert on this topic, but this person is. But then what makes you have enough expertise to judge somebody else's expertise? Like, how good are you at telling somebody isn't just a shyster? And I've been watching these American Greed documentaries on YouTube and these other things of these scam artists, and you realize how easily it is for people to fall into scams. Somebody, for example, just like the religions, like I don't believe them, but I tried to believe them for a while, and I thought these people were authorities. But what was my basis to think anybody who wrote about the Bible? I thought these people literally had met Jesus, and they were writing about their experience with Jesus. Then I go to find out that nobody who wrote anything, if they can even find who wrote whatever it was, actually had physically met that supposed Jesus person. Everything was written years after, then edited and picked out, and there's like 66 different books. Some things contradict.
Translation issues.
And yet people base entire cultures on this thing. You look at some of these scam artists. Look at something like Theranos with Elizabeth something. She had a deep voice, and she was wearing the turtlenecks.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Moss, I think it was Moss or something. I don't know. Maybe the blonde, the big eyes, and she had that Theranos company testing the blood tests and things like this, like doing this thing. And then all these people who were supposedly big time, very, very knowledgeable in those fields of tech and Silicon Valley and things like that, all got duped. They all fell for it. They gave her all this amounts of money and things like this. And then when you see this interviews, people are like, the person was really charismatic. You know, they really knew it. And like, no, you're just covering for yourself because you don't want to just admit that you fell for a rather clear scam.
Yeah.
So this whole idea that because I'm not an expert, you somehow still have the ability to know who the expert is.
Yeah.
That's always questionable to me. Like, who are you to decide who the experts are?
I get annoyed because there's a family friend who, I'm not going to mention his name here, but he'll always say things like, oh, this professional historian says this. I read this from a professional. But the thing is, I know that if I were to debate this person, I could cite people that I like, and I know he would try and dismiss them. But then I can say, okay, well, Tom Woods has a bachelor's from Harvard, PhD from Columbia. Thomas Sowell, PhD from Chicago. I can point, but I know he would dismiss them because he doesn't agree with their views. So then when it comes down to it, is it actually the credentials you care about, or is it just someone on your team and you're holding up those credentials to justify it?
And another thing with those credentials, it's like, okay, this person did this. The founding fathers founded the nation, but they held slaves. So everything they said about the founding of the nation, I'm going to throw that out. So that comes with a thing where people are getting canceled for things they said in the past, or they did in the past. And that whole reading I had with that 1976 letter from Marx to Engels, where he talks about LaSalle and calls him a Jewish N, like things like that. Would they do the same? Do they cancel their own giants and their own members because of the things they said? It's like you look at the Bible. People say there's certain things about what God did. I'm like, are you going to cancel God because he said it's okay to have slaves? You have people in the black community who say because the founding fathers owned slaves, they're negative. Will you say because God allowed for slavery, I'm going to throw everything else that I consider positive about God out? Like, it's.
Well, I was thinking too. I don't know. Do you know who Marcus Garvey was?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, he actually had a positive view of the KKK because his reasoning was, well, we both want the same thing. We're both separatists. We can just go our separate way. And it's ironic because now, if a black person were to say that, it'd be, what the hell is wrong with you? But he saw it as, well, we just wanted the same thing ultimately, even though you can point to that organization and say how many people did they lynch, how many people did they terrorize, all that. So,
and there seems to be a significant, a growing and loud minority. I'd say 5% of the politically active people in the Black community, in the African community, African American community, that seem to be saying those similar things. What the black national separatists, or what are they called? Black nationalists that want separate locations. Yeah. I recently had a conversation with my dad about like the situation that was happening with the natives, and also wondering with that, like, do the natives, some natives want reservations where they're independent under their own kind of rules and laws and things like that. And then he was talking like, well, is that because they were put on reservations to begin with, and then they've now, just the same way, like if a child is raised in an adverse environment, they start taking on those negative, abusive, and harmful things that the generations have been raised in it. But it seems there are some natives that are completely okay with having their reservations that are separate from the greater society of the United States of America. Yet you'll find some that want to be part of it. You see that now happening with certain Black movements. We want Black-only spaces. We want, like, some are going directly and saying we want actual locations and nations within the country, which is similar to the reservationists, similar to the things that KKK were saying, like Black people shouldn't be in this area. That's the same thing they're saying. Black people should only be in this area. That is the same side of the same, it's not even two different sides of one coin. It's the same side of the same coin. It comes down to whites and Blacks should not share this area.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, so let's see if there are any more points in here. I think we're getting to the end here. Let me see. Yeah, so then there's just some other stuff. It's not some of it's just sort of things that we've talked about already, but he basically says, like, the new history of capitalism, it's not really new, it's just rehashed socialist ideas that they're basically viewing American economic history through a socialist lens, essentially. And I think you saw that piece where even Marxists criticized the whole America was built by slaves argument, which I thought was very interesting, and saying, yes, people were exploited in creating America. I don't entirely agree with that, but of course they take that argument, but they apply it from a different angle, that slavery was oppressive, but they basically would echo the argument that I would, that America's greatest economic growth occurred after slavery ended. So the socialists have their own explanations for that, but they at least acknowledge that fact. They don't try to say, oh no, the country's growth came entirely from slavery. So let's see what else here. Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly stuff we've talked about already. Again, just how they only talk to people who already agree with them. Let's see. The whole thing about Lincoln, about how he's been whitewashed. What's that?
What, if any, reaction or counter to this has come from anybody involved in the 1619 project? This critique that was given. What are some of the critiques? Like we mentioned, the things that I've seen are things like her saying, "Oh, you can't critique me on a historical basis because it's not history," and then on the inverse, flipping around and being like, "Oh yeah, this should be taught as history curriculum." So, have there been any attempts to actually address the actual points that are brought up in these critiques?
I think if I remember correctly, and he talks about this in here, that they did sort of address, like, they wrote like a little letter basically to these historians saying, I think it was like, yeah, some things were a little wrong, but we're not gonna retract this, and they were very quiet about how they did it. Basically, let me see here.
I might try to find that letter. If it's not too long, I might read it as a video.
Oh yeah, so Nicole Hannah-Jones attacked James McPherson and Gordon Wood, who are two of the most famous Civil War historians. And then it was funny too. Magness points out that there's actually a lack of racial diversity among the scholars who advised the 1619 project, which is pretty interesting. Nicole Hannah-Jones herself is Black, but several of them were white as well, which, you know, kind of, it's like that thing going around now about how the BLM protest, you see a lot of white people.
And I was asking that, is it some sort of like reducing space for Black bodies, like black protesting bodies, like protesters of color? Are we squeezing out protesters of color? Like, Portland, where it's had supposedly the most active, it was 70 something days now. I think we're on like day 73 straight of protests in Portland.
Yeah.
Portland is like 1.4% black African American in any kind of sense like you want to say. And you look at those protests and what are they really protesting?
Yeah. I think they just sort of quietly, they didn't really apologize, but they were just kind of like, yes, a few things were off. But it's being criticized, but then of course you also have people like Oprah pushing it now, and I don't know. It's kind of a contentious thing because I feel like there's certain people that are pushing this, saying it's great, but then a lot of the mainstream and even outside of the mainstream are saying no, this is full of errors. Don't rely on this. Yeah. So there's also the 1776 project you may have heard of. How let's see, Coleman Hughes is one. I know Wilfred Riley, who I've posted a lot from, is another. They basically wrote this as a rebuttal to the 1619 project because they basically said, no, this is spreading lies. We want to correct the record. But this is actually being done by black scholars as well. So they're trying to show, no, this is wrong. Let's push back against it. So this is getting quite a bit of pushback from different people. Yeah. I'm wondering if this is one of these things that may kind of disappear quietly because it's coming under attack by too many people. Like they'll never retract it, they'll never apologize, but they'll just start to downplay and then focus on something else.
There are some things that do happen like that. Like there was a few actual incidents that occurred with police brutality that didn't quite pan out with the narrative that was going on, that just seemed to kind of be hushed over until they got the George Floyd one, which was rather clear. But now the George Floyd, the other videos come out. But that was rather clear. 8 minutes on the neck. That's absurd. So that was rather clear. But some of these other things, like the jogger incident, the incident with at the gas station, where it was like, okay, this person kind of was like, what was he doing at the gas station? Who is this person? Some of these things have kind of been hushed over, where it's gone. But as you mentioned, I think with this one, the 1619 project, I don't think it's made its full rounds yet. It's something that I think sparked up, but so much has been going on. It's the heated election season, a lot of other things going on with the pandemic and things like that, where I think it might actually be something where we might be able to do a follow-up sometime, give it a couple of months or something, even a month or something, and see if there's more things around. Like that 1776 project sounds like it might be something interesting to look into and see what else is done in relation to this. It might have some interesting rebuttals and take on the actual content. And as I mentioned, that letter addressing the critiques, if it's short enough, I think it's like less than a 30-minute read, I might do that as a separate video as well to add to this.
Right.
And we also said the topic on slavery. I think that is one of the just patently false things that people say, specifically about the United States of America with its enshrinement of freedom of speech, that talking about slavery, talking about these topics is something that's not allowed. It's patently false that it's not allowed. Like the people are recently saying like, oh, what Trump is doing with TikTok and the social media type of things is beginning to look like China. No, it's not looking like China. Like China, the Chinese Communist Party is everything and more that people accuse Trump of being. You have someone like Biden, the flubs that he's making, the behavior that he has is what people are accusing Trump of. It's like, when I'm just asking for some consistency. If you say this is a problem, it should be a problem whether that person is your cousin, your brother, your son, your father, or some random politician of some party that you dislike. It should be a problem because it's a problem, not because of who is doing the actual thing.
Yeah.
And the closer we get to that, I think the better it is for just understanding, because America is the most diverse culture that has become that successful with ideas and thoughts and peoples and cultures. And I just feel like they might be throwing this away by backsliding to this kind of this anti-thought, anti-communication, anti-discussion kind of mentality that's going on when we have these amazing platforms and access to information.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. So 1619 project. I think that has been the double discussion. I definitely think we'll have one more on this. What are your general thoughts on the thing? When did you first hear about it? I don't know if we talked about this in the previous one.
I mean, I think I had first heard about it. I don't know if it was when it was written, maybe a little bit after. I added Phillip Magness probably, I don't know if it's a few years now. He's not, I mean, I don't really talk to him regularly. He's just somebody I follow. Occasionally I share his posts. But I saw that he was writing all these articles, and I thought, okay, these seem really well written. And then I saw that he said, okay, well, I'm going to do a book where I'm going to compile all of these articles just so it's streamlined and you have them all in one place. And I don't know if you remembered, but I was sharing a bunch of these articles as they were coming out. You know, I mean, it was probably over, I don't know if it was over the course of a year or so, but it was over an extended period of time. So I think in more recent times, as people are reading his thing, but then he's also, I don't know if you've seen over Twitter, he's arguing back and forth with Nicole Hannah-Jones, and they're kind of, it seems like they're kind of taking shots at each other where he'll say like, oh, you know, I offered to speak to you, you said no, and she'll say, oh, Phil Magness doesn't know what he's talking about here, and it's kind of a shame in a way. It's like you almost wish they could do like a public debate or something and sort of hash it out, but it just seems like...
and the platforms are there. That's why it's so absurd that the platforms are there. I mean, I see certain sides being like, we're open to debating, and other people who don't seem to be wanting that discourse. Especially a lot of people who often say we need to have a conversation, but they want that conversation to be set and limited in certain rules. Those are a lot of the same people who say that are the ones who say certain words that you can't say, or you have to be XYZ to speak about ABC, and like that's already limiting the actual ability to have these conversations that you say are so important. So what is it? And just like we're talking about, where is the consistency? Is it this or is it that? Can we actually define what have a conversation means? Like, what does that mean? It's like, no, we can't define capitalism. We never define capitalism. Should we ever define what racism is? No, we can't define what racism is. We can't define what 2 is, because sometimes 2 + 2 = 5, and that might be another conversation we need to have.
That's been a whole war on Twitter, and I think you saw even Popular Mechanics wrote a thing saying, no, 2 + 2 can be 5. I think, what is...
and that's, to me, that's the thing. Again, problems occur not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. So I understand, depending on how you define 2, and then there's the explosion theory and things like that. But if you just come out and present 2 + 2, most people will be just thinking you just mean 2 things. 2 fingers + 2 fingers = 4 fingers. They wouldn't think you mean like 2 cows, two bulls versus 2 cows can equal like 5, like 2, like 6, because like a calf will come out. Like, that's not the kind of mentality that people have. If you're talking like, about that, yes.
The analogy that was made is like, if you're going to say pigs can fly, well, when you say pig, do you mean a pig, or do you mean, is that slang for a bird or something? I mean, if you say, oh, this is slang for a bird, okay, you're right. But it's like, you have to be very clear in what you're saying. Otherwise, it's, what are you trying to say to me?
So I think that's as good a place as any to leave off on this segment of it. And thanks for having the conversation. As usual, it's been great. And thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this and you haven't heard our first one, go check that out. And then this one will be up whenever this is up. But that first one is definitely up already. I've already posted that. And this one I'll post it probably a week, or it's a few days after, and this week after recording it. And anything else?
No, I mean, I hope everyone at least got some value from this. And again, please do your own research as far as reading the 1619 Project yourself, but also the critique. And look, if we made errors, if there's things you didn't pick up, feel free to interject. I mean, there's always stuff to be learned.
Yeah, with this one, I think I'll be specifically checking on the comment section of this one and the other part, because in this conversation series, I do want to have it to be as interactive as possible, and then we can actually come and have the discussion. Maybe if you have a comment or something on it, maybe we'll just do a repeat. We might do, if we do more of these, we had this with a separate conversation series with Stephen, and there's already things we've taken down. Might get to a situation where if I set this up as an independent thing outside of my channel, where I have things where the people who come on these conversations with me, if you comment, and there's enough comments or enough value and substance in the comments, we can address that in follow-up videos, or at least in the comment section. I'm sure Stephen will also take some time, finds this to be valuable enough. So that's it for me.
That's all. Yeah. Thank you, Silas.
Okay.
We'll talk again soon.
Signing off.
See you.
Goodbye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.